My name is Brooke Miller. I am 28 years old, and for the last decade, my parents have called me nothing but the basement creep. To them, I am the shame of the family, the daughter who hides away while the real world moves on. They never asked what I was building down there, never cared to know why I spent sleepless nights with nothing but the hum of my computer for company. But what if all those years of silence were not failure at all, but the foundation of something far greater than they could imagine? What if one holiday dinner in front of everyone they wanted to impress the truth slipped out in the most unexpected way? Tonight, I will take you with me into that room, where one question stopped the laughter cold and turned the spotlight on the daughter they swore would never matter. Let me take you back to where it began. "We're embarrassed to call you our daughter." Those words from my father have been echoing in my head ever since he spat them out across the dinner table. His voice was so steady, so clinical, like he was delivering a diagnosis. And my mother sat there with her lips pressed together, nodding ever so slightly as if she agreed with his every word. To them, I was not a daughter, not a person with dreams or accomplishments, but a burden, a disappointment, a creep who wasted her life away in the basement. I sat alone in my basement room that night, my laptop casting a cold blue glow across the walls. On my desk lay the newest issue of Forbes folded open to the page I had stared at 100 times already. The title stretched across 2 pages in bold letters: 30 Under 30 Healthcare Innovators Changing the World. And right there in the middle, tucked between 2 bright smiling faces, was a profile of B. Miller. No photo, no real name, only initials. But the analysis was clear and thorough. The algorithms I had built for memory rehabilitation were being praised as revolutionary. Anonymous genius reshaping cognitive medicine. I ran my fingers over the page and let the words sink in. To the world, I was a rising innovator. To my family, I was a parasite. I closed the magazine and looked around the space they mocked as a hideout. What they called a dungeon of wasted potential was actually the command center of NeuroBloom Labs, a company valued at $250 million. 3 walls of monitors displayed real-time server data. Over 6 million active users, $120,000 in daily revenue, clinical results that made even Harvard researchers weep with envy. I leaned back in my chair and let my eyes close for a moment. The echoes of my father's voice were still there. "Brooke, you're 28 years old and you live in our basement playing computer games." He always said it like a closing argument, his way of hammering in the final nail. Computer games. That was his way of reducing everything I had built. He had no idea that yesterday the Department of Veterans Affairs approved a $20 million contract to use my technology for treating PTSD in soldiers. To him, I was a recluse, a broken daughter who never grew up. I turned in my chair and stared at the framed letter hanging above my desk. It was creased and patched with tape but still legible. My acceptance letter from Carnegie Mellon, the one my father had torn in half in the kitchen when I was 18. He had called it a fantasy, a waste of money. He had said we would not throw tuition at someone who lived in a daydream. That letter was the moment I realized I would never have my parents' approval. I taped it back together, framed it, and kept it on the wall as a reminder. Their support was optional, my drive was not. The memories of those early years pressed in. Working late shifts at the diner coding until 3 in the morning, eating ramen because it was all I could afford. While they slept comfortably upstairs, I built the foundation of the technology that would one day restore memories to the elderly, give independence back to stroke patients, and let veterans find their way through trauma. I pushed away from the desk and stretched my arms. The smell of dust and electronics filled the basement. I thought of tomorrow, Christmas Eve, when the entire family would gather around the dining room table. My parents, my sister Claire, her fiancé Mark, and a dozen aunts and uncles. I would take my usual place at the far end, invisible, while everyone praised Claire for her career and her upcoming wedding. They would look at me with pity, maybe even disgust, wondering when I would finally join the so-called real world. But tomorrow would be different. Tomorrow Mark would see me clearly. He worked in law, handled intellectual property disputes. I knew he had come across my name without realizing it was me. And tomorrow night, surrounded by candles and wine glasses and the smell of roasted ham, he would connect the dots. He would realize the basement creep was the mind behind the app that gave his grandmother back her memory. I walked over to the mirror propped against the far wall. The reflection showed a woman with tired eyes but a steady jaw. Not the lost girl they saw, not the failure they whispered about. I whispered to the reflection, "You are not their disappointment. You are their reckoning." The sounds of movement drifted from upstairs. Cabinets opening, the clink of plates, the faint music of Christmas carols playing on the old speaker in the living room. My parents were setting the stage for tomorrow's dinner, unaware of what was coming. I imagined my mother fussing over the china, my father rehearsing introductions for Claire, and Mark already planning how to boast about the successful daughter and her perfect match. I sat back down at my desk and opened my email. The subject line at the top of my inbox read, "Acquisition offer. Apple is prepared to finalize at $250 million. Decision needed by Friday." I let the words sink in. The company they thought was my computer hobby, the hours they called wasted, had reached a value they could not even imagine. I saved the email and closed my laptop. My hand rested on the cool surface for a moment, and a calm spread through me. This basement that had been my prison was now my liberation. Tomorrow night, when the wine flowed and the carols played, when Mark and the others spoke the name B. Miller aloud, my family would finally see me. Not as the creep, but as the daughter who had been building something they never understood. I turned off the lights, leaving the glow of the monitors behind me. The house above was quiet now, except for the faint hum of Christmas lights outside. I placed my hand on the banister and began climbing the stairs. Every step carried me closer to the battlefield waiting upstairs, the one where my family still saw me as the failure. For one more night I would play that role. I would sit quietly, endure their comments, let them believe what they wanted to believe. But in less than 24 hours, the basement creep would have her moment in the light. And when that moment came, nothing in this family would ever be the same again. I remember the sound of paper tearing more vividly than I remember most Christmas mornings. I was 18, standing in the kitchen with my acceptance letter clutched in my hands, the official seal from Carnegie Mellon catching the overhead light. My heart had been beating so fast I could barely read the words, but I knew what they meant. I had a future, a chance to study computer science at one of the best schools in the country. My father took the letter from me before I could even finish explaining. He skimmed the first lines, his jaw tightening. Then he tore it in half, right down the middle, the sound echoing in the silence of the room. The two pieces fluttered to the floor like broken wings. "We are not paying for that nonsense," he said calmly, almost like a doctor delivering bad news. "We will not throw money away so you can play with machines and waste your life." I remember looking at my mother, hoping she would object, hoping she would say something to soften the blow. But she only shook her head and folded her arms. "Claire has real goals," she said. "She wants to go into nursing. She will actually help people. We need to save for her education." Claire was standing by the fridge, pretending not to listen, but the smirk on her lips told me everything. She had already been promised everything I had been denied. Tuition support, a car, even the small lake house in Wisconsin someday. She was the shining daughter. I was the liability. That night I sat on my bed staring at the torn pieces of the letter. My hands were shaking, not from grief, but from a stubborn anger that refused to let go. I taped the pieces back together with strips of Scotch tape and smoothed the wrinkles as best I could. I pinned the letter to the wall above my desk. It became my silent promise. If they would not believe in me, I would believe in myself. The years that followed were a blur of exhaustion and hunger. I took shifts at a 24-hour diner outside Milwaukee, pouring coffee for truck drivers and eating the leftover pancakes customers left behind. I cleaned offices at night, scrubbing floors until my back ached. I stacked boxes at a warehouse on weekends, moving through the aisles with sore arms and raw fingers. And then I came home to the basement and opened my old laptop. The screen lit up the dark like a lighthouse, and I coded until my eyes burned. Algorithms spilled across the glowing screen. The smell of cheap ramen filled the room. I watched the sun rise through the tiny basement window more times than I can count. While upstairs, my family slept soundly in warm beds, I was teaching myself how to build something that could change lives. The isolation was crushing at times. Holidays passed with me downstairs, listening to laughter and clinking glasses upstairs. They never invited me to join, or if they did, it was with a tone that told me they expected me to decline. To them, I was wasting my life. To me, I was building the first pieces of what would become NeuroBloom Labs. I remember the first time I tested the earliest version of what would become Mindhaven. It was a crude program, just a series of memory puzzles, guided by a system I had designed to adapt in real time. I used it myself, watching how it adjusted when I struggled with a pattern or when I succeeded. It was clumsy and awkward, but I felt the spark. The idea worked. It could grow. When I finally graduated from a small community college near Milwaukee with my computer science degree, I did it without a penny from my parents. I walked across the stage in a borrowed gown, no family in the stands, and I felt free. They thought I had wasted years. In truth, those years had given me the skills to turn a taped-together letter into a life they could never imagine. My parents never asked what I studied. They preferred to tell neighbors that I was going through a phase, that one day I would stop hiding in the basement and find a real job. I let them. Their words only fueled me. Every insult became another line of code, every dismissal another late-night session that pushed my algorithms closer to perfection. I can still see Claire standing in the doorway one evening when I was 21. She leaned against the frame with her nursing textbooks clutched to her chest. She looked at my screens, the glowing graphs and streams of data, and she laughed. "You think this is going to mean anything," she said. "You are wasting your youth. No one will ever care what you do down here." Then she turned and walked away, her ponytail swinging like a whip. That moment carved itself into me. It was not just my parents. It was my entire family. They had written me off before I even began, and that, I realized, gave me a kind of freedom. I no longer needed to prove myself to them. I only needed to prove myself to me. I taped more notes to the walls, covered the basement in sticky notes with formulas and sketches. I scoured library shelves for books on neuroscience, memory pathways, and rehabilitation therapies. I built small prototypes and tested them with online volunteers. I learned to hide my successes behind initials, never attaching my full name to my work. It was easier that way, safer. Years passed and the project grew. I still remember the first thank you email I received from a veteran who had tried the program. He said it had given him focus again, helped him sleep, helped him remember things he thought he had lost forever. I sat in my chair holding the printed email, tears rolling down my cheeks, because for the first time I knew it was not just a dream, it was real. But if my parents noticed the changes in me, they never said. To them, I was still the girl who lived under their feet, tapping away at a keyboard, avoiding the real world. They would never admit that while Claire was celebrated for working long shifts at the hospital, I was quietly building something that would reach millions. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass of the basement window that night and let the cold seep into me. The torn letter still hung on the wall, taped and faded but unyielding. It had been a curse when it was torn apart. Now it was my shield. Christmas was only hours away, and the old ache from that night 10 years ago burned in my chest again. They would all be gathered upstairs, laughing and toasting, raising their glasses to Claire and Mark, while I sat at the far end of the table like a ghost. But not this year. Not after everything I had built. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, steadying myself. Tomorrow would not just be another dinner. It would be the moment the tape came off the letter for good. The proof I had been holding back for a decade was ready to burst into the light, and when it did, they would never see me the same way again. The basement hummed with the soft vibration of machines, the faint whir of cooling fans, the glow of monitors stacked across 3 walls. It was a sound and sight that had become more comforting to me than any lullaby from childhood. I sat in the chair I had practically grown into, staring at the dashboards that updated in real time. 6.5 million users active across the globe each session, a small light in the darkness of memory loss trauma or aging minds. Revenue ticked upward like a steady drumbeat, $120,000 a day flowing in from contracts and subscriptions. To my parents, it would look like meaningless numbers, just computer games. But I knew the truth. These numbers meant a stroke survivor somewhere was regaining the ability to hold a conversation. A veteran was sleeping through the night without nightmares. A grandmother was remembering the names of her grandchildren again. On the far left monitor, new messages filled my inbox. My eyes fell on one with the subject line, Department of Veterans Affairs contract approved. My heart kicked in my chest as I opened it. The words blurred for a moment as I read confirmation that the government had finalized a $20 million deal with Neurobloom Labs. I leaned back in my chair, my breath catching. $20 million. For a project that had started in this basement with sticky notes and ramen-stained notebooks? For technology my family would never acknowledge as anything but a hobby. My fingers brushed against the surface of my laptop as I thought about how many hours I had spent hunched over it, how many nights I had willed myself to keep going while everyone upstairs slept. The basement, cold and dim, had become more than my sanctuary. It was the heart of an empire they did not know existed. I reached over to the small shelf where I kept a worn black notebook. Flipping through its pages, I saw sketches of early algorithms, charts of user tests, even the scrawled words I had written at 19 when exhaustion threatened to drown me. Keep building. They will see. The ink had smeared in places, tears staining the margins. The company had grown beyond me now. 40 employees across 3 states, research assistants, engineers, clinicians. Yet I still came down here every morning bare feet on the cold cement floor because I never wanted to forget where it began. An email notification popped up again. This one from Apple's acquisitions team. The subject line was short and sharp. Offer to finalize at $250 million. My pulse spiked. They had been circling for months, dropping hints at conferences, reaching out quietly through intermediaries. Now they were ready to move. I closed the message without replying. I was not ready to think about selling. Not before Christmas, not before tomorrow. I had other battles to fight first. I stood and stretched, arms aching from too many hours frozen over the keyboard. My reflection caught in the black screen of a dormant monitor. The face staring back was older than the one who had taped together that torn letter 10 years ago. There were faint lines near my eyes, shadows that no amount of sleep seemed to erase. But there was also strength, a woman who had created something that mattered. I walked across the basement, my hand sliding along the old wooden beam that jutted out near the stairs. When I was younger, my father had called this place a tomb. He told me I was burying myself alive. But standing there now, with contracts signed and millions of users depending on me, I knew the truth. This was no tomb. This was my cathedral. I opened the file cabinet in the corner and pulled out a manila folder. Inside were printouts of research trials, graphs showing improvement percentages, clinical studies that had confirmed what I already knew. Mindhaven worked. In some trials, memory retention increased by 30% in just 2 months. Processing speed improved by 25% across all age groups. These were not empty numbers. These were lives changed. I thought about the faces behind those statistics. The veteran who had written me a thank you letter, telling me he could finally remember the sound of his daughter's laugh. The grandmother who had been able to play cards again with her family. The teenager recovering from a brain injury who had regained the ability to keep up in school. They did not know me, not really. They only knew the initials B. Miller. And that was how I had wanted it. Anonymous, safe, hidden. But tomorrow, the hiding would end. I glanced at the garment bag hanging near the door. Inside was the navy blue dress I had worn to Carnegie Hall when I accepted the Digital Health Innovation Award. The dress had shimmered under the stage lights, the cameras snapping, as I held the plaque with my initials engraved. No one in my family had seen the photos. They did not even know the award existed. Tomorrow I would wear it again. Not for the cameras this time, but for them. I sank back into the chair and pulled my knees up, hugging them as memories of the early years washed over me. Nights when the basement felt endless and silent, when the only sound was the click of keys. Nights when I doubted myself so completely, I wanted to quit when I wished I could run upstairs and hear my parents say they believed in me. But those words never came. So I learned to believe in myself. The monitors continued to glow, a silent reminder of everything I had built. I shut them down one by one, the hum fading until the basement fell into quiet darkness. The only light came from the small string of Christmas lights I had hung along the wall. I left them on their warm glow, softening the edges of the cold cement. I pressed my palm against the taped letter on the wall, the one from Carnegie Mellon. The tape was yellowed now, the paper fragile, but it still held, just like me. I whispered to the empty basement, "Tomorrow they will know." The furnace clicked on upstairs, sending a low rumble through the floorboards. The smell of pine drifted faintly down the Christmas tree standing tall in the living room above me. I imagined my mother arranging ornaments, Claire laughing with Mark as they hung stockings. They believed the holiday would be about them. They had no idea what was waiting. I climbed the stairs slowly, my hand sliding along the banister. Each step carried me closer to the surface, closer to the world where I was still the family's embarrassment. At the top, I paused, listening to the muffled sounds of laughter and clinking dishes. My father's voice carried clear, confident, talking about Claire's career and how proud he was. I exhaled and turned back toward the basement. For tonight I would return to my sanctuary. Tomorrow the basement creep would walk into the dining room in that navy dress, and everything would change. The smell of roasted turkey and cinnamon drifted through the house as I walked into the kitchen the evening before Christmas. My mother stood at the counter arranging pecan pies with the precision of a pharmacist, her hands moving quickly, her lips pursed tight. She barely looked up when I came in, though she did slide a covered dish an inch to the left, as if my presence might contaminate her perfect layout. Claire was at the table with Mark flipping through real estate brochures. She tapped one with her manicured finger and laughed. "This lake house in Wisconsin has such potential. Once it is officially ours, we will renovate the whole place." Mark nodded, clearly, indulging her, but my stomach tightened at the way she said ours. The house had always been my grandparents' pride, a place filled with childhood summers for both of us. I knew in that moment the decision had already been made. My parents had chosen Claire to inherit it. My father entered with his usual air of authority, a medical journal tucked under his arm. He glanced at the brochures, and then at Claire with a smile. "It makes sense. You are the responsible one. You know how to take care of property and family." He did not look at me when he said it, but the weight of his words fell heavy. I wanted to ask if I was family at all in his eyes. Instead, I stayed quiet, standing near the counter, listening as they made plans for summers I would not be a part of. My mother finally turned to me. "Brooke, do not start anything tomorrow. This is Claire and Mark's time. We want to celebrate without any drama." Her tone was clipped, not pleading, but commanding. She wanted me invisible, tucked away like a blemish they could not cover. I forced a smile. "I will not ruin anything." Claire smirked, closing the brochure. "You could not ruin it if you tried. Some of us were just meant to carry the family forward. Others are content hiding in the basement." I felt my chest tighten, but I swallowed the anger and let her words hang in the air. Mark glanced at me briefly, his brow furrowed, but he said nothing. Later that night, as I carried a box of ornaments back to the basement for storage, I overheard my father's voice drifting from the living room. "We cannot let her embarrass us tomorrow. The Millers will be here, the Rodriguezes, half the neighborhood. I do not want her strange habits overshadowing Claire's engagement." My mother murmured in agreement. "She will sit at the far end of the table. If anyone asks, we say she works with computers. Keep it vague. No one needs to know details." I closed my eyes, standing in the hallway with the box pressed against my chest. They had rehearsed this before, crafted stories to explain me away. Tomorrow was no different, only larger, more public. When I stepped into the living room, they stopped talking. My father cleared his throat, pretending to read his journal. My mother fussed with a centerpiece. Claire whispered something to Mark that made him chuckle nervously. I carried the box downstairs, without a word, the weight heavier than it should have been. That night in the basement, I could not focus on the monitors or the endless data streams. I sat on the edge of the bed and thought about how easily they erased me from every story they told. It was not just neglect. It was active dismissal, as if they believed I had no right to claim any part of the family's legacy. I lay down, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sound of laughter upstairs. My parents had chosen their golden child, and they wanted me hidden. But a quiet part of me smiled in the darkness. They believed I was powerless, a ghost at the edge of their celebrations. Tomorrow, when they toasted Claire and passed around pie, they would finally see who I really was. Morning came with the clatter of pans and the smell of coffee strong enough to seep through the floorboards. I climbed the stairs, carefully bracing myself for another day of rehearsed indifference. My mother was already moving fast around the kitchen, her hair pinned back, her apron dusted with flour. She glanced at me with polite tightness. Brooke set the table. I obeyed, laying out the china they only used on holidays, smoothing the crisp white cloth, placing silverware just so. The dining room gleamed under the chandelier, polished and perfect. As I worked, Claire breezed in, wearing a red sweater dress, her engagement ring sparkling like she had polished it just for the occasion. She twirled in front of my mother, who clapped her hands. "Stunning, darling. Everyone will be so proud." My father came in, adjusting his tie. "Remember, no mention of your computer projects tonight, Brooke. Keep conversation light. We do not want to confuse the guests." He said it like a final warning, a prescription he expected me to swallow without question. I looked at him calmly. "Of course. I will do exactly what you ask." Inside, though, I felt the calm burn of resolve. They thought they could control the narrative. They had no idea the story was already slipping from their hands. As I finished setting the last glass, my mother stood back to admire the room. She smiled at Claire, then at Mark. Her eyes slid over me without pausing, like I was part of the furniture. Mark caught my gaze for a moment. There was something different in his eyes, a flicker of unease, but he quickly turned away when Claire tugged at his arm. The grandfather clock chimed noon. Guests would arrive in a few hours. I walked back toward the basement stairs, my footsteps steady. The dining room sparkled with promise of celebration. But for me, it was only a stage. Downstairs, I opened the garment bag and ran my hands over the navy blue dress. Tomorrow was no longer the word on my lips. It was today. And when I stepped into that room, I would not be invisible. I would be undeniable. I slipped the dress from its hanger and laid it across my bed, the deep navy fabric catching the low basement light. My fingers traced the hem, remembering the night at Carnegie Hall when it shimmered beneath the stage lights. The applause of strangers had filled the room then. Tomorrow, it would be the stunned silence of family. I tried it on, smoothing the fabric down over my hips, adjusting the neckline. In the mirror, propped against the wall, a woman stared back at me who was not the girl they thought they had buried beneath their expectations. My hair needed soft curls, my makeup, a light hand, nothing flashy but enough to make me look polished. The dress was more than clothing. It was armor. My phone buzzed on the desk, dragging me from my thoughts. A message from Harper lit the screen. "Remember who you are tomorrow. You built this. No one can take it away." I smiled, a small but steady smile. Harper had been with me since the early days, back when NeuroBloom was little more than a handful of code and an idea that lived in the glow of my laptop screen. Her faith had been a lifeline when I nearly drowned in self-doubt. A second notification appeared, this one from Lawrence Kim. "Rumors say Apple is ready to push hard after the holidays. They will not wait forever." I turned off the phone without replying. Let them wait. Tonight I needed clarity. I folded the dress back into the garment bag and zipped it slowly, sealing away the version of myself that would face the world upstairs. The rest of the afternoon moved in fragments. I polished my shoes until I could see my reflection in the leather. I checked the monitors one last time, watching the user count climb past 6,600,000. The numbers pulsed like proof, steady and undeniable. By evening, the house upstairs had grown louder, the clatter of serving dishes and the rise and fall of voices drifting down through the floorboards. Laughter here, the pop of a cork there. My parents were rehearsing perfection, oblivious to the storm waiting just beneath them. I climbed the stairs quietly and stepped into the hallway. The kitchen was a flurry of movement. My mother darted between the oven and the counter, her apron dusted with flour. She looked up at me with the same clipped smile she always gave when company was near. "Brooke, can you arrange the flowers on the sideboard?" Her voice was softer than usual, almost conciliatory. I recognized the pattern. After every harsh word or intervention, she would offer me some small task, a bandage to cover the wound. I nodded and took the white roses from her hands, their petals cool and delicate against my skin. As I arranged them in the crystal vase, she hovered nearby. "You know, we just want what is best for you, Brooke. Your father may sound harsh, but he means well." I kept my focus on the flowers, tucking sprigs of pine between the blooms. Of course. My father entered the kitchen, then his tie perfectly knotted, his hair combed with surgical precision. He looked at me with a mixture of authority and forced warmth. "We love you, Brooke. We only want you to find stability, something real." The word real caught in my chest. He could not imagine that what I had built downstairs was more real than anything he would ever touch. Before I could reply, Claire swept into the room in a shimmer of red satin, her engagement ring flashing as she twirled for effect. "Stunning," my mother gasped. "Absolutely stunning." Mark followed her, smiling politely, his hands tucked in his pockets. His eyes met mine for a brief second, and there was something there I could not name. Curiosity, uncertainty, maybe recognition. Claire turned to me with a sweet but sharp smile. "Glad you could join us. Just remember, tonight is about us. Keep things simple." She meant silent, invisible. I gave her the same smile I had practiced for years, polite and unreadable. Dinner was still an hour away, and the house buzzed with preparation. I carried the vase into the dining room, the roses glowing softly under the chandelier. The table gleamed with china and polished silver, each place card carefully written in my mother's neat script. My own card had been placed at the far end, away from the head of the table where Claire and Mark would sit. I stared at it for a moment, then set the vase down. The grandfather clock chimed 6. Guests would arrive soon. I excused myself and returned to the basement, my heart steady now. I unzipped the garment bag and slipped into the navy dress again. The fabric hugged me like a promise. I fastened the clasp at the back, stepped into the shoes, and looked into the mirror. The woman staring back was no ghost. She was a storm contained in silk and leather. Upstairs, the doorbell rang, the first wave of relatives arriving with coats and gift bags and bottles of wine. Their voices rose, filling the house with the sound of tradition. I touched the taped letter on the wall one last time, then turned off the basement light. My hand trailed along the banister as I climbed the stairs. The sounds of laughter and greetings grew louder with each step. At the top, I paused, taking in a deep breath. The stage was set. The players were gathering. Tonight the truth would wait only a little longer before demanding to be seen. The doorbell rang again, followed by the rush of cold air as my father opened the front door. Relatives poured inside with their coats bundled in their arms, their cheeks red from the December wind. The living room filled quickly with voices, the clink of wine glasses, the familiar rise and fall of laughter that had excluded me for years. I lingered near the hallway, watching as my mother fluttered around like a conductor directing traffic and ushering guests toward the dining room. Claire glided from one group to another, her hand tucked possessively through Mark's arm. She introduced him again and again, glowing with pride at every compliment. My place was already decided. I was handed coats to carry, trays to move, errands to run. At one point, my Aunt Cheryl glanced at me with a sympathetic smile. "You are always so helpful, Brooke. It is nice that you can pitch in." The word stung more than if she had said nothing at all. Helpful was the title you gave someone who had no place of honor. By 7, the dining room was ready. Candles flickered in the center of the long table, the scent of roasted turkey and sage filling every corner of the house. Guests settled into their seats and I found my card at the very end. I sat quietly smoothing the napkin across my lap while the room hummed with conversation. My father raised his glass to begin the evening. Tonight we are grateful to be surrounded by family and friends and to celebrate Claire and Mark's engagement. His voice carried the weight of a practiced toast, his smile wide. Around the table glasses lifted, and Claire leaned in to kiss Mark's cheek. The spotlight was fixed on them, and I was the shadow at the edge. As the first course was served, my uncle leaned across the table and asked what I had been doing with myself these days. Before I could answer, my mother cut in smoothly. Brooke does some consulting with computers. She helps businesses with their systems. It keeps her busy. The conversation moved on before I could open my mouth. I sipped my water slowly, the bitterness in my chest stronger than any wine. Claire laughed loudly at something Mark whispered, and the table erupted in chuckles. My father beamed with pride, soaking in the admiration. Then my cousin Tyler piped up. Brooke, still in the basement, playing those games. The words were met with light laughter, not cruel but dismissive. My father chuckled softly, not correcting him, not defending me. I felt the heat rise in my face, but forced my expression to remain calm. Mark's eyes flicked toward me across the table. Just a flicker quick enough that I wondered if I had imagined it. His smile faltered for half a second before returning, but the look stayed with me. As plates of turkey and stuffing were passed around, my mother leaned toward me. Just enjoy yourself tonight, Brooke. Do not overthink things. Her tone was gentle but final, as if my only contribution was silence. I chewed my food mechanically, hearing the cadence of conversations around me. My father discussing medical research with another Dr. Claire, describing her plans for a new condo, relatives reminiscing about summers at the lake house. My name was not spoken once. When dessert was brought out, the laughter grew louder, the wine looser. My aunt praised Claire again, saying how proud everyone was to see her starting her new life with such a promising man. My mother dabbed at her eyes, overcome with emotion. And then, as if on cue, my father's voice cut through. We are so blessed to have such a successful daughter to carry on our family's name. His eyes swept over Claire, then slid right past me as if I were not there at all. I set down my fork, carefully, my hands steady, even though my chest felt like it was burning. Mark coughed lightly, setting his glass down. His gaze found me again, lingering longer this time. I felt the weight of it, the question forming but not yet spoken. Claire noticed and quickly redirected him, launching into another story about her nursing shifts. The moment passed, but not for me. The flicker in his eyes was enough to remind me that not everyone at this table was blind. I leaned back in my chair, letting the hum of conversation wash over me. Invisible, yes, but only for a little while longer. The clock in the hallway struck 8, each chime ringing like a countdown. I folded my napkin, rested it on the table, and allowed myself the faintest smile. The storm was still hidden, but it was closer now, pressing against the edges of the room, waiting for the right moment to break free. My fork hovered above the half-eaten slice of pie, the sweet taste gone from my mouth. The conversations around me blurred into one long hum of voices and clinking glasses. My father leaned toward Mark, recounting some story from his residency days, laughing too loudly, proud of his own cleverness. Claire leaned in, close, nodding at every word as if she had rehearsed her part for years. I kept my eyes lowered, but my ears picked up every detail. Aunt Cheryl asked my mother about summer plans at the lake house. My mother replied that Claire and Mark had already been looking at renovations. There it was again, the final nail in a decision I had never been consulted on. The lake house, the one place I remembered, chasing fireflies and swimming in the cold water until my lips turned blue, had been handed to my sister like a trinket. I wanted to say something. My lips even parted, but the words died before they formed. No one here would have listened. They never did. Instead, I glanced down the table and my eyes met Mark's. He had been watching me again the second time that evening. His expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered long enough that Claire noticed and placed her hand firmly over his, redirecting his attention back to her. The table filled with laughter, as someone told a joke about Christmas shopping, but my pulse kept time with the clock on the wall. Every tick sounded louder, every second dragging me closer to the inevitable. When coffee was served, I excused myself and slipped into the kitchen. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of cinnamon and nutmeg. My mother followed quickly, carrying a tray of empty plates. She set it down with a clatter and turned on me. "Brooke, remember what I said. No surprises tonight. Do not make this about you." Her voice was sharp, but underneath it trembled the fear of embarrassment. I picked up a towel and began drying the wine glasses, my hands steady. I only nodded. She hesitated, searching my face for something, then sighed and went back out to the dining room. I stayed a moment longer, staring at my reflection in the dark window above the sink. The dress looked even darker against the soft kitchen light. My face pale, my eyes calm but burning. I whispered to myself, just one more hour. When I returned to the dining room, the mood was more relaxed, voices louder, hands gesturing freely. Claire was telling a story about her first week as a head nurse, how she had saved a patient in crisis. The relatives clapped, my father glowing with pride, my mother nearly in tears. Someone glanced at me and asked casually if I had any stories from work. My father jumped in before I could answer. "Brooke keeps busy with computers. She is very private about it." The dismissal stung, but I let it pass. Mark was watching again, and this time his brow furrowed. His hand tapped lightly against the table, restless. The night stretched on, the candles burning low, the clock edging closer to 9. My chest felt tight, but my hands were calm in my lap. I listened, I observed, and I waited. Claire leaned back in her chair, her wineglass half empty, her cheeks flushed. She laughed at something Mark whispered, then turned toward me with a smug smile. "Brooke, maybe you can finally explain what it is you actually do. Everyone is curious, right?" Her tone was sugar-coated, but the edge beneath it was sharp. A few relatives chuckled politely. My father shifted in his seat, his eyes warning me not to open my mouth. My mother set her fork down slowly, her lips tightening. For a moment I let the silence stretch. Then I smiled and said, "I will tell you when the time is right." The table shifted uneasily, some curious, some uncomfortable. Claire laughed too loudly and waved it off. "Never mind. It is probably nothing worth mentioning anyway." The words slid over me, but I did not react. Inside, though, my heart was steady. Because the time was coming. It was so close I could almost feel it humming in my veins. The night continued with chatter about vacations and promotions, about weddings and children, all the milestones I had never been invited to claim. I sat at the end of the table, invisible in plain sight, my hand resting lightly on the stem of my glass. And then, as another round of laughter filled the room, I caught Mark's eyes again. This time he did not look away. His lips parted slightly, as if a question was forming one he was no longer able to keep inside. I leaned back in my chair, waiting. The storm was no longer pressing against the edges. It was inside the room, now circling, ready to strike. Mark set his glass down with a soft clink and leaned forward, his eyes fixed on me. For a moment, the chatter at the table blurred into background noise, the laughter and clinking silverware fading under the weight of his gaze. He tilted his head slightly, as if piecing together something just out of reach. "Brooke," he said slowly, his voice carrying enough weight to quiet the nearest conversations. "Forgive me if this sounds strange, but have we met outside of family gatherings?" The question caught me off guard, though I had expected it in some form. My heart thudded once, but I kept my face composed. "Not that I recall," I answered, my tone calm. Claire laughed quickly, a little too loud. "Of course not, Mark. She never leaves the basement." The table erupted in chuckles again, and the tension eased for a moment. But Mark did not laugh. His eyes stayed on me, narrowing with recognition that seemed to sharpen by the second. Dinner carried on with small talk about travel and politics, but Mark's focus never shifted. I felt it like a thread tugging at me across the table, his curiosity growing heavier with each passing minute. At one point, when dessert plates were being cleared, he leaned closer to Claire and whispered something. She brushed it off with a flick of her hand, annoyed, but I caught the words. App research initials. My stomach tightened. He was connecting the dots faster than I had anticipated. My father stood then to refill his glass, his voice booming to the room. We are so fortunate to have Claire to carry this family's legacy forward. She is everything a daughter should be. His words landed like stones, each one meant to bury me deeper in silence. Mark's jaw tightened at that, and I noticed. For the first time, someone else at this table did not seem fully convinced by my father's script. Later, as coffee was poured, my cousin Tyler asked about the inheritance again, joking about who would get what when my parents were gone. The laughter that followed was light, but my mother answered without hesitation. The house in Wisconsin is already set aside for Claire and Mark. It only makes sense. The air in my chest turned cold, though my expression did not change. There it was spoken plainly, the erasure made complete. Mark's brow furrowed, his hand tightening around his cup. He looked from Claire to my parents, then back at me. For a moment he seemed ready to speak, but Claire cut in with another story about her new condo, pulling attention back to herself. I excused myself, quietly standing and carrying my cup to the kitchen. The clatter of dishes and muffled laughter carried from the dining room as I rinsed it under the tap. My hands trembled for the first time all night, though not from fear. It was the weight of everything pressing closer, the truth, no longer safely hidden. I heard footsteps behind me. Mark stepped into the kitchen, his voice low. "Brooke, can I ask you something?" I turned, drying my hands on a towel, keeping my face even. "Of course." His eyes searched mine, steady and sharp. "You are B. Miller, aren't you? The one behind Mindhaven." The air seemed to still around us. For a long moment neither of us moved, the hum of the refrigerator the only sound. I held his gaze, my heart pounding, but my voice calm. "What makes you think that?" he exhaled, shaking his head slightly. "I have been reviewing patents for months. Your algorithms, the adaptive memory framework. I saw the initials everywhere. Tonight, when I looked at you, I realized why the name felt familiar." I pressed the towel flat against the counter, grounding myself. Claire's laugh drifted from the dining room, high and carefree, as if she were still the only one glowing under the chandelier. Mark lowered his voice further. "My grandmother has been using your program. It gave her back her stories. It gave her back herself." His words hit me harder than I expected. I swallowed, my throat tight, but I managed a small nod. He stared at me for another moment, then whispered, "Does anyone here know?" I shook my head once. He looked toward the dining room, his jaw set. Then he leaned closer, his tone almost a promise. "They will." Before I could respond, Claire called for him, her voice sharp with irritation. "Mark, dessert is waiting." He gave me one last look, a flicker of respect, before turning back toward the dining room. I stayed in the kitchen for a moment, the towel clenched in my hand, the hum of the refrigerator filling the silence. The storm was no longer waiting. It had already touched down, and nothing could stop it from spreading through the house. I returned to the dining room and slipped back into my seat, the hum of voices swelling around me again. The candles had burned low, their wax dripping onto the polished silver holders, but no one seemed to notice. My relatives were deep in conversation about inheritances, as if they were already carving up the family legacy before the ink was even dry. Uncle Robert leaned across the table, his voice carrying above the clatter of forks and cups. "So, Harold, have you and Margaret finalized the will? Everyone deserves to know where things stand." My father sat taller, clearly pleased to be asked. His hand rested on the table like a judge about to deliver a ruling. "Yes, Robert, we have. The Wisconsin house will belong to Claire and Mark. The family trust will be managed by Claire, as she is the most responsible. As for Brooke, well, she has chosen her own path." A ripple of murmurs passed through the table. Some nods of approval, others awkward glances in my direction. I kept my face neutral, though inside I felt the words land like stones. Chosen my own path was their way of saying, "Cut out, without shame." Mark shifted in his chair, his hand tightening around the stem of his glass. His eyes flicked to me, then back to my father. "With all respect, Sir Brooke has worked hard too. I do not think it is fair to dismiss her role in the family entirely." Claire's fork clattered against her plate. "Mark, really, She has been living in the basement for years. She has no career, no assets, nothing. Why should she be included? The room grew tense, the easy laughter gone. My father's expression darkened, his voice sharp. Brooke has embarrassed this family enough. She contributes nothing to society. Everything Claire has achieved, she has earned with dedication and sacrifice. That is why she deserves the future we are leaving behind. I felt the blood rush to my face, but I stayed still, my hands folded in my lap. Mark's jaw tightened, and his voice dropped low but steady. Sometimes dedication and sacrifice do not look the way you expect. Claire shot him a look of warning, her cheeks flushed. Do not start this here. But the seed was planted and the room had shifted. A few of my cousins exchanged glances, whispers darting across the table like sparks. Aunt Cheryl cleared her throat nervously, trying to steer the conversation back to safer ground, but my father pressed on, determined to have the last word. We are proud of Claire. She will carry our name with honor. Brooke, on the other hand, has wasted her life hiding behind screens. That is not something we can celebrate. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. I could hear the faint tick of the grandfather clock in the hall, each second stretching. My mother dabbed her lips with her napkin, refusing to meet my eyes. Finally, I spoke, my voice calm but carrying across the table. It is interesting to hear how little value you think my work has, especially when it touches more lives than you could ever imagine. My father froze, his eyes narrowing. Do not make a scene, Brooke. But it was too late. Mark leaned forward, his voice firmer now. She is not making a scene. She is telling the truth. Claire's face turned crimson, her words sharp as knives. Mark, stop. You do not know what you are talking about. His gaze didn't waver. I know exactly what I am talking about. The air crackled with tension, every set of eyes bouncing between us. I sat perfectly still, my pulse steady now, the fear replaced with something stronger. For the first time, someone else at this table was standing beside me, and that alone shifted the ground beneath my parents' carefully built facade. My father opened his mouth, but Mark spoke again before he could. Brooke has done more for this country than you realize. The words landed like a thunderclap. My mother gasped, dropping her spoon against her saucer. A hush fell over the room, the chatter silenced as everyone turned toward us. I breathed in slowly, feeling the storm gathering around me, no longer circling, but ready to break wide open. The grandfather clock struck 9, its chime echoing through the silence, sealing the moment in place. My father's eyes fixed on Mark, as if he had just committed treason. The fork in his hand hovered midair, then clattered onto his plate. You have no idea what you are saying, he snapped, his voice low, but sharp enough to slice through the silence. Mark did not flinch. His hand rested firmly on the table, his knuckles pale but steady. I know exactly what I am saying. Brooke isn't some aimless girl wasting away in a basement. She is the one behind Memory Vault. The name landed like lightning. A few relatives gasped outright. My cousin Emily set down her wine glass so hard the stem cracked. Memory Vault. You mean the app everyone is talking about? The one on the news. My father's face hardened, denial flooding his features. That is ridiculous. Brooke could not possibly build something like that. She has no training, no discipline, no credibility. I met his stare calmly. I built it. The words rolled off my tongue, steady and sharp, like a stone that had been polished smooth over years of silence. For a moment, no one breathed. The chandelier above flickered as if the electricity itself recognized the weight of the confession. Claire's voice cut through the stillness, shrill and trembling. She is lying. She always lies. Brooke cannot even hold down a real job. Mark shook his head, his voice steady. I saw the contracts, Claire. The federal grants. Her company works with veterans with hospitals across the country. Your grandmother, Mrs. Wilson, is one of the people who benefited. My mother's hand jerked and her wineglass slipped from her fingers, shattering on the hardwood floor. She stared at me, her face pale, her lips trembling. Brooke, no, that cannot be true. It is true, I said softly, my voice cutting through her disbelief. For 10 years I built it every night while you called me a disappointment. Every morning while Dad told me to stop wasting my life. 8 million people use my software now. Gasps rippled around the table. Some leaned forward hungry for more details, while others recoiled as if the truth were a flame too hot to handle. My father slammed his hand on the table, the sound like a gavel. Enough. You think you can waltz in here and embarrass us in front of family? You expect us to believe that you, the girl who never amounted to anything, created something that scientists around the world are praising? Mark's voice cut through his fury. They are not just praising it. They are building on it. She has changed the entire field. I turned to Claire, who sat rigid, her mouth tight, her eyes darting nervously between Mark and me. You wanted me invisible. You wanted me forgotten. But tonight you got your wish in reverse. You are the one fading into the background, not me. Her cheeks flushed crimson. You are pathetic, Brooke. Playing with computers does not make you special. I leaned forward, my voice low but carrying to every corner of the room. Tell that to the families who can talk to their loved ones again. Tell that to the veterans who no longer forget their children's faces. Tell that to the NIH when they call my algorithms the cornerstone of their research. The room shifted again, the balance of power tilting visibly. Aunts and uncles who once dismissed me now looked with awe, curiosity, even respect. Cousins whispered, pulling out their phones as if to verify the claim. My father's jaw worked, his face red, but no words came out. He looked at me as though I were a stranger who had broken into his house. My mother finally spoke, her voice shaking. Brooke, why did you never tell us? Because you never wanted to hear, I answered quietly. Every time I tried, you shut me down. You tore up my acceptance letter to MIT. You told me therapy was my only option. You called me broken. Her hands trembled as she reached for her napkin, pressing it to her lips. Tears gathered in the corners of her eyes, though whether from shame or sorrow I could not tell. The storm inside the room had broken open now. There was no taking it back. Aunt Cheryl leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper, but audible in the stunned quiet. Is it true, Brooke? Do you really run an $85 million company? I nodded once. Every contract, every grant, every employee pay stub has my name on it. The silence that followed was deafening. My father tried again, his voice rough. Even if what you are saying is true, it does not change the fact that you hid it. You deceived us. I straightened in my chair, meeting his glare without blinking. I hid it because I knew exactly how you would react. And I was right. Mark's hand brushed against mine under the table, a silent gesture of support. For the first time all evening, I felt the weight of isolation ease just slightly. Claire shoved her chair back, the legs scraping harshly against the floor. This is insane. She is manipulating you all. She is nothing. Mark's voice carried like steel. She is everything you pretended not to see. The room buzzed with murmurs, fragments of disbelief and wonder. Some leaned toward me, hungry for more proof, while others looked at my parents, waiting for their response. My father sank back in his chair, his face ashen, his authority stripped bare. My mother sat frozen, staring at me with eyes wide and wet. Claire stood trembling, her fists clenched at her sides. The storm had finally broken, and in its wake lay silence, shock, and the undeniable truth. I breathed slowly, feeling the air in my lungs as if for the first time in years. The room was no longer the same, and neither was I. And this was only the beginning. The hum of voices rose like a low tide as the shock began to settle into whispers. Relatives leaned toward one another, some stealing glances at me, others staring openly. The chandelier's light seemed harsher, reflecting in every glass, throwing the cracks in our family wide open for all to see. Claire's voice cut through the murmurs, brittle and high. This is ridiculous. Brooke's making all of this up and Mark's helping her. She doesn't run anything. She can't. Mark's jaw tightened. He leaned forward, his voice measured but hard enough to carry across the room. I saw the documentation. Contracts, grants, the research papers. It is her work, Claire. You can deny it all you want, but denial doesn't erase facts. My father snapped, his voice louder than I had ever heard it. Stop this nonsense. Do you think I will let my family's reputation be destroyed at Christmas dinner? It was too late for control. The truth had already spread like wildfire. My Uncle James, who had been silent all evening, set his napkin down with deliberate calm. "Michael, your daughter's work is being published in journals I read every month. I've cited it myself. If this is her, then you should be proud." The air thickened with tension. My father's face turned crimson, the authority in his voice faltering. He had spent years dismissing me, painting me as broken, and now his brother was contradicting him in front of everyone. My mother whispered, her voice trembling, as though she was trying to hold on to some fragment of her old belief. "Brooke, why now? Why tell us like this?" "Because you never wanted to hear it any other way," I said quietly. "You needed an audience to see the truth. Without them, you would have buried it again." Claire's chair screeched against the hardwood as she shoved it back. "You always had to make it about you. You couldn't just let me have one night without stealing the attention." My pulse steadied, not racing as it once would have. This wasn't about attention. This was about truth. I turned to her slowly. "I didn't steal your night, Claire. You gave it away the moment you chose to stand on lies." Her hands trembled as she gripped the back of her chair, her face twisted with anger. "You are jealous. You always have been." Mark stood then, his presence solid beside me. "No, Claire. What you are feeling right now isn't jealousy. It's exposure." The room fell silent again, the kind of silence that presses against your chest, heavy and unyielding. Even the children, restless, only minutes earlier, sat wide-eyed at the tension that hung in the air. My father's voice dropped low and cold. "If this is true, Brooke, then you deceived us. You built a life in secret while letting us believe you were lost. That is betrayal." The word cut deep, but I did not flinch. Betrayal is tearing up your daughter's future because it didn't match your expectations. Betrayal is calling her a failure when she was working to help millions. For a moment, his eyes flickered, uncertainty breaking through the anger. My mother pressed a trembling hand to her chest, her breathing uneven. Aunt Cheryl leaned forward, her curiosity sharper now than her fear. "Brooke, if you really are behind this, what happens next? Where does it go from here?" Her question gave me pause. For years I had hidden behind silence. Now the floor was mine. I let the words settle before answering. "It goes everywhere. Hospitals, rehabilitation centers, homes like ours where families are fighting to hold on to memories before they slip away. It means that the darkness doesn't have to win so quickly." A hush spread through the table, heavier than anger, deeper than shock. For the first time, I saw tears in more than one pair of eyes, not from shame or disbelief, but from understanding. Claire's fist slammed against the back of her chair. "You think this makes you better than us. It doesn't. You are still pathetic. You are still the girl hiding in the basement." I stood slowly, my voice calm but unshakable. I am the woman who built an empire in the basement you despised, and I am not hiding anymore." The words landed like stones in water, rippling outward through every corner of the room. My father's mouth opened, then closed, his authority stripped away by something he could not argue with. Mark touched my arm lightly, his voice soft but carrying weight. "You don't have to defend yourself anymore. The truth is already louder than their denial." I looked around at the faces, at the fragments of disbelief, envy, awe, and shame. The storm had shifted. The denial was cracking. And underneath it, something new was taking shape. What it was, I could not yet name. But I knew the night was not finished. Not by far. The clock ticked on, steady and relentless, as if it were marking the closing of one life and the beginning of another. My father sat stiff, his shoulders tight, his jaw clenched, but the fury in his eyes had dulled into something heavier, almost like defeat. My mother kept dabbing at the broken glass on the floor, though her trembling hands made the task pointless. Claire remained standing, her face blotchy from anger, her knuckles white on the chair she gripped. Mark was the first to break the silence. He looked at me, then at the others, his voice calm but strong enough to carry. "I think you all need to understand that Brooke's work isn't just important, it's essential. Families like mine, like yours, depend on what she built. You call her a creep, but without her, people we love would already be gone." His words hung in the air. For once no one interrupted him. My Uncle James finally nodded, speaking with the slow gravity of a man who had watched his own friends decline with age. He is right. My wife's memory has been slipping for years. Her doctor recommended that app last spring. It gave us back conversations we thought we lost. Brooke, I never knew it was yours. My mother's eyes darted to me wide with disbelief. Her voice cracked. You mean this thing is saving marriages, families? And all this time, you were the one behind it? I nodded, not with pride or triumph, but with calm certainty. I was the one. Claire let out a harsh laugh, the sound brittle and empty. You are all fools. Do you not see what she is doing? She wants attention. She wants to humiliate us. No, I said, meeting her glare steadily. I wanted peace. I wanted acceptance. But I am done waiting for either from this family. Her face fell, her lips tightening into a thin line, because somewhere deep inside she knew the truth. My father tried once more, though his voice shook now. Even if all of this is true, it does not excuse the way you revealed it. You shamed us in front of everyone. The shame was never mine, I answered quietly. You created it when you decided I was less than your golden child. You buried my future when it did not fit your idea of success. I carried that shame for 10 years, but it was never mine to hold. Tonight I returned it to you. He sank back in his chair, his authority stripped bare, his shoulders sagging under the weight of words he could not take back. Mark reached for my hand, his touch steady. He whispered just loud enough for me to hear. They may never admit it, but tonight you claimed your place. I looked around the room. Aunts and uncles exchanged glances, some ashamed, some awed. Cousins stared at me with curiosity rather than dismissal. My mother's tears had dried into silence, her eyes hollow but searching. My father sat pale and beaten, and Claire, trembling with fury, was left exposed in front of the very people she had tried to impress. The storm had ended. The silence that followed felt different now, like the air after a downpour. Fresh, changed. Later that night, after the guests had gone, I stood by the window of my room looking out at the snow falling over Madison, Wisconsin. It was quiet, soft, and relentless, covering everything in a clean white sheet. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, not the basement creep they had branded me, but the woman who had stood her ground and told her truth. I thought of the basement office that had been my cage and my sanctuary, of the long nights coding while my family slept, of the tears I had hidden when their words cut deeper than they would ever know, and of the millions of people now living fuller lives because of the work they had dismissed as games. For the first time, I felt no need for their approval. Their recognition, whether it came or not, was no longer my burden. Downstairs, I heard voices still murmuring, strained but quieter. Maybe tomorrow there would be apologies. Maybe not. But either way, I had spoken and they had heard. The snow kept falling, and with it came a strange sense of peace. I thought of Amanda's grandmother, remembering her family's joy when she could once again recall names, faces, and holidays. I thought of the veterans who sent letters to my company, thanking us for helping them hold onto pieces of themselves. That was my validation. That was enough. Christmas dinner had not broken me. It had freed me. And as I turned away from the window, I knew this was not just an ending. It was the beginning of living without apology. If you have ever been dismissed, called less than, or made to feel invisible, then you know the weight I carried. But you also know the power of stepping into the light, even if it takes years to get there. Tell me, have you ever been underestimated by the very people who should have believed in you the most? How did you rise above it? Share your story in the comments, and if you want more stories of justice, karma, and family drama, make sure to stay with me. There are so many more truths waiting to be told.